introduce the keynote speaker for today. So Elisabetta Chicca, you started with a master thesis in physics at Sapienza University of Rome in 1999. And then you did your PhD in natural science at ETH Zurich, and also in neuroscience at the Neuroscience Center Zurich. And you continued with a postdoc, and after that became group leader at the Institute of Neuroinformatics in Zurich, which is jointly hosted by the University of Zurich and ETH. And you then moved to CTEC in Bielefeld, and you became their group leader for neuromorphic behaving systems group and worked until 2020. And now, since this year, you are full professor and chair of the Bioinspired Circuits and Systems group in Groningen at the Zernike Institute for Advanced Materials and the Cognitive Systems and Materials Center there. So we are really looking forward to hear a bit more about neuromorphic sensing and what this can offer for artificial intelligence in the near future. So with that, I leave over to you, Elisabetta, and I will stop sharing my screen.
Yes, I'm gonna share mine. Thanks a lot for the very nice introduction. Yeah, in fact, I moved here last summer, so it's very recent. I think you can see the screen now. It's in full presentation mode.
Yes, we can see your slide.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I'm really honored to be here. Thanks a lot for inviting me. It's really a pleasure. I really enjoyed the day yesterday. Many interesting talks, and also the poster session. Yeah, except the hiccups of the system. It was very nice to be there. Yeah, so today the talk is about exploiting temporal dynamics in neuromorphic sensing. This is something that Fredrik already anticipated, but before going into that, I would like to tell you a little bit about the group. So the group is called Bioinspired Circuits and Systems Group. And what we do is really looking at how computation is done in biological systems, so in the nervous system, and try to understand this biological computation by implementing models in hardware. And so the core research that we're doing is really fundamental research. We are trying to understand how the brain works. And we do that by emulating neuron functions on physical substrates. We have a long history of using full custom CMOS system as a physical substrate, but more recently, we are also working on hybrid memory-stiff CMOS systems. And as Fredrik already anticipated, this is now embedded in the Zernike Institute for Advanced Material and the Groningen Cognitive Systems and Materials Science Center, which is really an ideal environment for doing this kind of research. Then as a side note, but kind of important, because doing this is really expensive, both in time and in money. I mean, using this physical substrate, you don't want to do this immediately when you have an idea, but you have to develop your ideas further. And for that, we use standard technology. We use digital processors. They're very useful for us for fast prototyping of ideas. So in this case, we do simulation of neural networks, and we follow the conservative approach that industry has recently came up with when they approach the field of neuromorphic engineering. So an example is something you might be aware of, the Lohi chip by Intel, and the other example here is the Spinnaker system developed in Manchester. So this is just to give you an overview about the research, but then let's go back to the topic of today, which is sensing. And I would like you to think for a few seconds about what the 5 senses have in common. And one thing that they have for sure in common is that the temporal dynamics of the sense signals carry a lot of information. So how the signal changes over time, it's an important thing. And our brain is for sure specialized in extracting features of these temporal dynamics. And we wanted to do something similar. So we came up with a computational element that we call time difference encoder. And I'm going to shortly explain you the principles of this computational module. And we have two input channels represented here, and everything is event-based. We always work with spikes, so we try to closely mimic the biology. So we have neurons that emit spikes, or so-called action potentials. And so those will be two input spikes coming to this module from two different channels. And when a spike comes on this particular channel, time is sampled, and you could imagine that time can be sampled, for example, by putting charge on a capacitor. And then over time, we let this charge leak away. And this leakage here is basically keeping track of time. Now, when an event comes on the other channel, we sample the value of this variable, and we use this as a gain modulating a synaptic weight. So there is a synapse that is receiving these inputs, and this synapse is going to generate a current that is going to be integrated in a neuron, which is proportional to this value here. So this is the idea. Just to show you what it does, here we have three typical examples. One is, these are again the two channels. We often call them facilitatory and trigger channel. And here you have the gain that I showed you before. Here you have the current that is produced by the synapse. Here you have the membrane potential of the postsynaptic neuron, and here you have the spikes. So now if the two events come in the right sequence and with a short time delay between them, then the gain would be high enough that the synaptic current is gonna drive the neuron above threshold, and several spikes are gonna be generated. If the sequence is the correct one, but the delay is too long, the gain would be too small, the current too small, it's gonna go into the neuron, but no action potential is produced. And this is, of course, a directional element, because if the first event comes on the trigger channel, the sample gain is going to be 0, so there are no spikes coming out. And so this behavior can, of course, be characterized by changing the delta t, that's what you see in the x-axis here, and measuring the number of spikes that are produced by the neuron. And as you can see here, the number of spikes is going to give you a measure of the delta t. So we have a kind of a linear encoding, and depending on what you do on the several transformations here, but you can get a linear encoding of the delta t in terms of number of spikes. And just as a quick note, we have already CMOS implementation of this computational model. I'm not going to go into the details of this, but I have some backup slides in case you're interested. And we have started applying this idea to all the senses. And today I'm going to show you examples in all the senses except taste. That's something we haven't touched on yet. And because of limited time, I'm going to shortly touch on most of them and give you a bit more details on vision. And then I hope, in case there is curiosity on some of the senses that I didn't touch a lot, we can deal with that in the question session. The reason of this choice is also motivated by the fact that the vision project is a more mature one. So some of them that I'm presenting, I have preliminary results, but it's there is not much more yet, but many good ideas for sure. So let's start with smell, and let's start with a very simple thing. Like identify the location of a gas source. So trying to figure out, okay, there is a gas source somewhere. I want to know if it's in the direction of my right or my left. And I can use that to navigate in the environment and reach this gas source. So we did this in collaboration with the group of Michael Schmucker in the UK. And they are using commercial sensors. And then you can have two sensors at two different positions, so that if there is a gas propagating into the air, it's gonna, if it comes from the right, it's gonna reach this sensor first and then the other one. And then you can use the TDE to figure out which sensor was reached first. And we do this with a very simple network here. We have sensor events, so the measured data from the sensor is transformed into spikes, and we have an encoding for the right and the left sensor. And then what we do is a simple onset filtering, because the sensor will be on for a long time, signaling that the gas is present over a long time. At the sensor, we are basically mostly interested when the plume of gas arrives to the sensor. So the onset filter is really doing that, just becoming selective to onset only. And then we have two TDEs. One is going to respond when the gas goes from left to right, and the other one from right to left, just because of how we connect the two channels. And this is what you can get. So you have the situation in which the gas was coming from the left and going to the right sensor. Here you see several trials, so several repetitions of the same experiment over time. And the colors are matched to the colors you see in the network. So here you see that the left sensor was activated before the right one. Then you see two small spikes here. These are the output of the onset filters. And then the last one is the TDE. And correctly, in this experiment, only the red TDE, detecting left to right, is responding. And of course, when you do the opposite experiment, when the right starts before left, then again, you can see the onset filters being activated by the two signals, and you can see the correct TDE responding. And as you can imagine, you could use such response to drive a robot in a real world scenario that is supposed to find the source of an odor. And these are experiments that are being carried out at in the lab of Michael. Okay, let's move to hearing. And we move to hearing by expanding a bit the same concept I just presented to you. So a typical interesting experiment in hearing is sound source localization. Also here, the information is provided by the difference in time between two events. And the two events are the arrival of the sound on the right and left ear, for example. So that's what you see here. So measuring this time difference in arrival of the sound, the orientation of the sound source can be estimated. And you can now think, okay, in gas, the dynamics of the stimulus itself are very slow, and it takes time to go from one place to the other, from one sensor to the other. So it's really kind of nonsense to try to really estimate the direction of the source. As you have seen, we were just doing, okay, the source is on the right or on the left, but with sound, you can imagine that it's pretty reasonable to look at that. So you can refine how you use the TDE, and now you can imagine that you can change the time constant of the gain factor that I showed you at the very beginning. So this is again the transfer function of the TDE, similar to what you have seen before. Again, you have delta T here, and you have spike count here. And now what we did is we created three different TDE with three different time constants for the gain factor, which is, we have one TDE that is tuned to very short delta T's, another one that is tuned to intermediate one, and a third one tuned to long delta T's. And so you can imagine that now, by looking at the activity of the TDE, when a particular source at a particular location is active, you can, by identifying which one of the three TDE is more active, you can identify the delta T, and therefore you can estimate the angle. So you can do sound source localization. Let's move to the next one, touch. So we have applied it also to touch, and in particular, we have applied it to texture perception. The idea here is, again, inspired by biology and by the fact that when we want to perceive a fine texture, the resolution of our perceptors on the fingertip is not high enough. So what we do is we slide the finger to perceive it. And now imagine that this texture has a special regularity, that there is a special regular pattern in the texture, which is kind of common. When we slide at constant velocity, this special regularity will be transformed into a temporal oscillation. And so now you can imagine that if you know the velocity and you can detect the frequency of this oscillation, then you have again an estimate of the spatial texture in this task. So we thought, okay, we can use this to do texture perception. And we came up with the idea that, okay, the pressure is going to be in a simplest case, and we're still kind of there. We have to move to more complex case, but imagine that everything is perfect, and now you slide the finger and you get a perfect sinusoid. Then you just use an encoding block to transform this sinusoid to spikes. And again, also here we have done things very simple. And now once you have the spike, you can have a block that is really trying to detect which frequency is present at the input. And by knowing the frequency, you could make an estimate about the kind of texture you are perceiving. And here you have the example of silk. So to go a little more in details, and again, if you want to know more, I have backup slides for later. We constructed a network which is based on what we call the spiking phase lock loop. So the phase lock loop is a common concept in electronics. So it's an oscillator that can lock to the input when the input is periodic and of a frequency close to the intrinsic frequency of the oscillator itself. And we use the TDE to create a phase lock loop based on spikes and spiking neurons. And so we have a first layer of SPLL, how we call them, tuned to different frequencies. And now they will all try to match the input frequency, which is the one related to the texture. But one of them will manage better than the others because his starting frequency is closer to the input one. And then that's what we want to detect. And we did again some filtering similar to the one that you have seen in the previous example of the gas sensing. And after some filtering, we can use a so-called winner-take-all network to detect which PLL is best synchronized with the input stimulus. And by doing that, we can have an estimate of the texture at the input. So this is especially for Frederick and some colleagues that might be working on related things. So I know, Frederick, that you're still interested in vibration and working on detecting vibrations and so on. Of course, here we applied it to touch, but you can apply it to anything that has some frequency in it. It's a promising thing. We don't know yet how far we can get with it. As I said, we tested it in these very simple settings. We still don't know what it can give us when we have normal signals with all the frequencies embedded in it. But this is definitely one of the things that we want to investigate to figure out then also how you can apply this this concept to different applications. Okay, now we can move to the last example, which is sight. And here I'm gonna take a bit more time also to tell you a little bit about how you can do sensing in an efficient way, starting from the sensor. And because of that, I want to introduce the concept or the difference between clock-driven versus event-driven sensing. And this is what this plot is about. So imagine you have a signal that you want to acquire that is changing over time. The classical approach is that you slice time. So the classical approach is that you use a clock, and at every clock cycle, you acquire your data. And if you think about vision, what you have to notice is this data is not only this particular function, which would be, in this example, the luminance at a particular pixel, but there you really do this acquisition for the full frame. So it's not just one data point, this one, but it's many of them, because at each clock cycle, you do this acquisition. Now, what is the problem with that? There are two problems highlighted here. One is redundancy. So when the signal is not changing much, you still keep on getting the data because you always acquire no matter what the signal is doing. At the same time, when the signal starts changing faster than your clock rate, then you're going to lose information. Event-driven sensing solves both problems, and this is what you get when you do event-driven sensing. Now, the lines are horizontal, because now what you do is you sense only if your signal changed of a given amount, and the given amount is the difference between the two bars. So now, when the signal is not changing, you avoid redundancy, and you avoid redundancy twice. First of all, because in the signal itself, you only get one data point for all this time in which there is no change. Secondly, because now the data that you get, it's really local data. You get it only if locally there is a change. So you don't get a full frame in case of vision, but you get to update that particular pixel that had a change. So redundancy is solved very well. At the same time, you can do fast sensing, because now if things are changing very fast, your sensor is going to acquire more data because they are useful this time. And so you also solve the problem that you were losing information in the clock-driven sensing. Okay, so we stick to vision for this example, but you should try to generalize this concept. For example, I show you a project on touch, and we work a lot on touch. It is amazing in a negative way to me to see that in robotics, touch has been done by following the approach of vision. So I can kind of imagine why vision went to frames, also historically. But you can think that in touch, you have a much bigger problem provided by clock-driven sensing, because in touch, events are really rare and local. So getting data from the full scale of a robot at every clock cycle, it's really a waste of resources. Okay, but as I said, let's stick to vision for this example now. And when you do sensing in this way, you end up with such data in terms of vision. So this is from one of the silicon retinas designed in the Toby Delbrück's group in Zurich. And this is what you see when you have this kind of camera on a car driving in a street. So you basically see where luminance is changing, and that's why you have black and white pixels here, because they're telling you where the luminance became lower or higher. So now you can think about this example like, you know, moving somewhere and objects moving in your visual field, and you might be aware of the concept of motion flow. So motion flow is what you experience very clearly if you're sitting on a train that is moving in a straight line, and you would observe by looking outside that the trees close to the track of the train will move very fast in your visual field, while the houses and mountains far away, they will slowly move in your visual field. It is very well known that insects use motion flow to estimate distance of objects and therefore navigate in the environment, avoiding collisions. So we put all these things together, you know, the event-based sensing, motion flow concept, TDE, and we came up with what we call the spiking elementary motion detector. So very closely inspired by the classical elementary motion detector proposed a long time ago. So the Riker detector. Now the TDE is here, and the two inputs to the TDE are 2 pixels of such a sensor. So now the number of spikes coming out of the TDE are going to be an estimate of the motion flow. The higher the motion flow, so the faster things are moving in the environment, the more spike the TDE and therefore the EMD will produce. So high motion, high spikes, high number of spikes, and that means you want to go away because high motion means things are close to you. So we put all these ideas in a network inspired by insects, and we put everything on a robot. And I'm gonna just show you quickly a video. So then with this robot, we started doing experiments that are in line with what neuroscientists do with insects when they study their flight behavior. So the corridor experiment is a very typical one. Of course, we're not flying, but we get as far as we can. And this part of the video is also to show you that the robot performed quite reasonably also in a normal environment. But then, of course, on top of making nice videos, we want to characterize closely the behavior of the robot. And that's what you see here. Here there is a wide robot, a wide corridor and a narrow corridor. So the narrow one is basically barely bigger than the size of the robot. And here you see 10 trajectories of the robot in these 2 corridors. I haven't mentioned it explicitly. The robot is fully autonomous. The brain of the robot is on board, and this is a spinnaker system that you can see here. I have to get the pointer again. That's the spinnaker system there. This is here the DVS. And of course, you need some power. That's the battery. Okay. So we have done this kind of experiments, but we have done many more to characterize the behavior of the robot and compare it as much as possible to what insects do, so that we could come up with hypotheses about the neural substrate of flight behavior. There is a jump. So from here to here, we move from a real environment, a physical robot, to a simulated environment and robot, because you might imagine that these kind of experiments are very time consuming. So we want to make sure that our robot works in a physical implementation, but when we need to do extensive experiments, the virtual environment is really it's really important to let us do that. So also, I'm not gonna show you all the experiments that we did, but give you an idea. And as I said, this is a simulated environment, and here what you see is the same environment in 3 different cluttered conditions. So very low number of obstacles. Those are the blue squares, and the red is the trajectory of the robot. And as you see, in a very free environment, the robot is just going to do a random walk and explore the environment, collision free. That's a very easy task. When the clutter is medium, the robot is still going to go around, but it has to identify corridors. It has to identify regions where it can drive. So for example, it tried to go in this direction, but then it figured out, no, that's not a good place to go because there was something like a wall for the robot. And so he continued in another direction. And then if the environment becomes very cluttered, the robot has no other choice than stay in a small environment where movement is still possible, but it doesn't manage to go out of it. Okay, so again, you want to quantify this even better, so you can repeat this experiment many times for each obstacle density, and you can repeat it for many different obstacle densities, and that's what you get when you do this. So this is now obstacle density on the x-axis and time on the y-axis. And in these simulations, there were 3 possible outcomes. The red circles are labeled collision. So the robot still collides with obstacles, especially if the environment is very cluttered. And so we also measure failure in this case. The blue squares means left arena. That's the example you have here. If there is a lot of free space, it can happen that at some point the robot leaves the arena. And in that case, we stop the simulation. And the third condition is the time is over. So because sometimes the robot is doing very well, we don't want to simulate it forever. We decided a time for which we will stop the simulation if there weren't the other 2 events before. And what you see here is that for low obstacle density, the robot either leaves the arena or the time is eventually over. When the percentage of obstacles in the environment starts increasing, then you start seeing that collision can happen, that there can be a region where there are too many objects and the robot doesn't manage to avoid the collision. But still in the same environment, the robot is able to navigate properly. And the more you go up, the more you see the collisions. But you also see a lot of situations in which time is over and the robot could probably not properly navigate in the environment. And here I want to tell you about, again, taking inspiration from biology and also seeing the effect of this inspiration on behavior. What we did here in terms of navigation was really to mimic behavior as much as possible. And one typical thing that the insect does is saccadic flight. I didn't go into the details at the beginning, but motion flow gives you the information of distance also if you move in a translational way. If you do a rotation, the motion flow is going to give you information about the velocity of your rotation, not the distance of the objects. Disentangling these 2 components is very computationally expensive. It's possible, but it costs a lot of computational resources. And there are evidences that insects solve this problem with behavior, probably also taking into account that the resources available to them in terms of computation are kind of limited. So what they do is they fly straight and then they make a turn and then they fly straight again. And that's what we had our robot doing as well, so that the motion flow could be estimated doing the straight trajectory. And then a turn could be made to go in a direction of low optic flow. Of course, when you set everything up, you just do things as simple as possible. So what we did is that the velocity of the robot during the translational motion was constant. And this is absolutely not biologically realistic. Animals are very, very adaptive. So as you can imagine, insects slow down their flight if the environment is very cluttered. That's what we would do also driving a car, for example. So at some point we realized that the choice of the constant velocity wasn't really a good one. And that's what you see in this plot. Now, this plot is really counting success in this kind of plots and in 2 different conditions. So adaptive velocity and fixed velocity. So as you can see, if the environment is not very cluttered, it doesn't make a difference if you're adaptive or not. But later on, when there are a lot of obstacles, being adaptive gives you an advantage, and the success rate increase in comparison with a fixed velocity. Okay, so I think it's time to wrap up. And I'm gonna first do some conclusion really related to this example on site. And then I'm trying to generalize them a bit to sensing. So what we demonstrated, and unfortunately I didn't give you a lot of the details, but what we demonstrated in this project about obstacle avoidance is a system level analysis of a distributed parallel and asynchronous neural algorithm. The algorithm is composed of about 4K neurons and 400K synapses, and can perform biological relevant tasks. The agent guided by this algorithm robustly avoid collisions in a variety of environments. We have done tunnel centering, navigation in densely cluttered terrains, gap finding, and a bit more. So I didn't show all of this to you today. What is very important is in all these experiments that we have done, we have never fine-tuned parameters. So we use a single set of parameters. So there was some fine-tuning to find this set of parameters. But then the robot was free to deal with any environment and any kind of task with always the same set of parameters. By doing this research, we could come up with hypotheses of the kind, okay, maybe what the insect is doing is identifying regions of low apparent motions. We found that excitatory inhibitory neural structures can drive switches between different behavior, because that's what we have implemented in our system. And what I haven't mentioned so far is that all this work has been done in tight collaboration with biologists doing research on flight, on insect. And we really hope, to close the loop at some point, that these hypotheses can be verified in biology, and that this work can bring new insight in how the biological system performs these tasks. Okay, a bit more generalization and motivation for this kind of work is that nature evolved optimal solution for demanding sensory action control loops in animals with limited computational resources. And so flight control in insect is the example I provided you today, but there are many more. Porting the neural substrate of this solution to full custom architectures require a deep understanding of the biological system and can lead to the discovery of general principles of neural computation. And this is really the main drive of my research, but of course, I'm also interested in applications. And because of that, I have here a last sentence that says, this process also leads to the construction of specialized systems with unprecedented performances when implemented with extreme constraints of resources, for example, power, data, or size. So you might be solving a problem that has been solved already. So I'm not claiming that obstacle avoidance is not a problem that is not solved in robotics, but you might be able to achieve it with constraints that are not compatible with the current implementation. So as you can imagine, this has high potential for edge computing, wireless sensor networks, and so on. So this is really the take-home message of the talk. Let me use the last minutes to acknowledge all the people involved in the work. So there are some group members, some still in the group, and some who left for new jobs. Collaborators, it's very international. So this is the visually guided obstacle avoidance I mentioned is done with a collaboration with a group led by Martin Egelaf. So that's the group I mentioned doing research on flight and insects. Sound source localization and gas source localization is really a mixture of people, because these were projects that were somehow started or continued either at the Telluride Neuromorphic Cognition Engineering workshop or the Capocaccia workshop. And that's why these two workshops, which are the main venues for our community, are also in my acknowledgement slide. And with that, I would like to thank you for your attention after shortly flashing the funding, of course. Thank you.
Thank you, Elisabetta. was really nice introduction to event-driven sensing, and also I think several encouraging and exciting examples where we can see how this can be used. So I really appreciate that. Thank you.
Thanks, Frederick.
I liked also very much this concept of how you described that that with event-driven sensing, and I guess sensing in general, you can use this sensing actuation loop to modulate the system, and in this way you can improve the perception system.
Yes, yeah.
That's really exciting. So we have some questions in the chat, and I can read them up. So the first one is, how does the robot performance compare to other path-finding algorithms like A*?
Yeah, that's what we haven't done. We haven't done this comparison, and that goes back to the concept that I was mentioning at the very beginning. We are not solving a problem that hasn't been solved yet. We are really trying to understand how biology does it. So our first goal is not to compare with algorithms that are already in there. Our first goal is to make a hypothesis about biology. Our claim, which we cannot prove yet, is that in the long run, you can build this system in analog CMOS, and then we hope, because of doing that, you can compete with those algorithms in terms of resources. Maybe you have similar performances or even slightly lower, probably doesn't matter, but you can put them on a flying drone that can support minimum weight and power, and that would be the advantage. But as I said, this is for me, it's kind of a side effect, so it takes longer to be exploited, because the first goal is really the basic research and understanding how the brain works.
Okay, thanks. One more question. So from the plot, the timeout seems to be negatively correlated with obstacle density. Why is that?
The timeout. Because I see what you mean. The time over. Yes, because the time over is set in terms of simulation time, not in terms of time of the robot. So you can imagine that if the environment is cluttered, the computation is more expensive. So that's my. I don't know if I've thought about this before, but I think this is the explanation. So keep in mind, time over is real time, is not simulated time. I don't know if.
So if it's still unclear, please ask a follow-up question.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, it's difficult that there is no interaction with the people asking the questions.
We can also do this interaction. I can.
Oh, that would be nice.
I can have Mohammed allowed to talk. So Mohammed, if you want, you can speak up.
Yes, thank you for allowing me. Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah, basically, this is exactly my question. I thought that it's negatively correlated, and I didn't know why. For higher density, the time seems to be lower on that end. But you essentially answered my question. I thought it's measured in relative time in that sense.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
Okay. And the next question is from Marcus. So I leave over.
Yeah, I will ask the question then for myself. It's okay. To have this interaction. I was wondering, similar as Tosin asked already, there was a question about comparison, and I agree. It's the comparison to other computer like, or he said, for example, when you have this robot going through the tunnel, like it's a standard task. I think even in schools, these kind of things are done with a very simple, whatever, distance sensors or standard, I say now standard,
Yeah.
very simple FPGA.
Sure, it's a very easy problem to solve. Yeah.
I think a breakthrough would be there when there comes now strong arguments saying why now this dynamic vision neuromorphic computing, and you have mentioned sorry, I have a long question, because you mentioned like you don't like in robotics that the other sensings are done also in a vision similar to how the vision is done in robotics, and would be much more better on event-based. And you have shown several pros then for event-based computing, but I would like to see the complete matrix of the pros and cons of the neuromorphic approaches and the computer vision approaches, and with some
there are a lot of cons. I'm not going to hide them. So first of all, to give you a bit more understanding of the impact of the work, and I didn't have time to go into the detail, but everything on that robot is done on a spiking neural network, and this is a block diagram of the spiking neural network, and this is the sensor, and at the end, there are spikes coming out that are going to control the motor. And I mentioned the numbers, these 4K neurons and 400K synapses. So this is for now on a standard processor or on Spinnaker and so on, but we have all the ingredients to do this in CMOS, so we know how to do it. And that comes the cons. The cons is that it's very expensive, and so you don't do it unless you are sure and you have tested everything and you're sure it's going to work, because to benefit from the CMOS implementation, to make it very small and low power, basically you don't want to build a general purpose system, because for that you need a lot of infrastructure. So you're really gonna put on silicon this thing, and so you get a chip that costs some €1,000 that does only this. So if it doesn't work, it's a pity. And so it takes years to get there, and we're not there yet, but the promise is then you get this small and extremely low power. And then if the performances are comparable with the traditional algorithm, you gain that you can put it on autonomous agents that wouldn't be able to afford the traditional algorithms on board. So this is one thing. Then you were mentioning about this fact about the sensing itself. So for the skin, I'm really pro event driven, and it's even more than for vision. Really, in vision, you still have tasks in which things change all the time, and then it does make sense. It could make sense to get the frames, but really things like the iCab robot. The iCab robot is covered with skin, and this is very important because the iCab robot has to interact with people, and it is important that the robot can detect, for example, a collision with a human and prevent harm to the human. Mm-hmm. But this is very rare and local. Nevertheless, they went for, we just get data from the full scale, the full body, every clock cycle. And so in the acknowledgement here, I was too quick. There is, so the touch experiment is done by a PhD student embedded in a European training network called New Touch. So it's a whole training network for doing neuromorphic event-based touch for robotics and prosthesis as well. So I see touch as a kind of relatively unexplored and research domain for neuromorphic, and I think there are a lot of promises there. So I gave you one example of the big cons. There are of course others. and we could talk for hours about it, but
Mm-hmm.
I think you see that there are also many pros.
Yeah.
And
I see that, and you also mentioned in your presentation at some point you didn't have to tune parameters, and that's one of the nightmares of many PhDs who do standard deep learning approaches. Oh, which is now the best parameter setting and whatsoever.
Yeah, so we did tune parameters, but once.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I just think, you know, I'm not sure if it helps because this neuromorphic computing is still, it's not the mainstream thing yet. If it might help in general the community to have a very nice overview of all the pros and cons side by side, or maybe that exists even, then I would be really happy.
I'm thinking about it. So there I'm also part of a coordination and support action called Neurotech. And there have been a lot of interesting webinars. So there is also a strong educational component there, but we also collected a lot of resources in the field. And there might be something there. So, and we also have industrial partners. So we have been also looking at these kind of things in view of applications. So you might have a look of the website of Neurotech. Mm-hmm. And also recently there is a new IOP journal that we funded recently for our community, Neuromorphic Computing. I can send you details in the chat after I stop talking in case you're interested. And there recently there was also a roadmap published. So that could be also in the direction.
Yeah. Slack channel.
Yes, I will do that in the Slack channel. Yeah.
Would it also be okay, Elisabetta, to share the slides that you presented today?
Of course, I will. How should I share it directly on Slack, or is it it's a big file probably?
Or if you could share it with me and I can somehow make it available.
Okay, I will do that.
Okay. So thank you so much. And considering time, I don't think we have time for more questions. If you have more questions for Elisabetta, please ask them on Slack.
Yeah.
So thank you so much. And with that, I leave over to Marcus. Do you want to say something to prepare for the
No. I think now it's just 5 minutes. People should grab a drink, stretch themselves, and then we will be back at 10 for the start of the mentoring session. Thank you very much, both of you.